Story time with Stephanie Storey.
I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. Welcome to my show, Story Time. My guest today, her debut novel came out on my book birthday as well, my Raphael. We both came out on April 7th, 2020. Not exactly the greatest day to launch a book. We'll talk about that. This is not her first book. She is also has a PhD in clinical social work. And so she wrote a book about child rearing called When the Labels Don't Fit, which is, so I want to hear about that, about how we go from nonfiction to fiction. I have all kinds of things to ask her about because we have art in common. We have writing in common. We have so much in common. Welcome to the show, Barbara Linn Probst.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. And you have like the best last name. How did you manage to do that?
My dad. I can take zero credit for it, except for my husband. When we got married, insisted that I not take his last name. He was like, your name is too perfect for a novelist. You have to keep it.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you for joining me. As I said, we have so much in common because your debut novel, because I'm so fascinated by it, because art is at the center of this transformation of your protagonist. I always hate telling the plots of other people's books because people butcher mine so often. So we'll let you tell our listeners a little bit about the plot of your book, and then I'll have a bunch of art questions for you.
Okay. Well, should I hold the book up?
Sure.
Here we go. It's beautiful. Is it backwards or is it the right way?
Oh no, it's absolutely the right way. And I don't even think I said the name of your book in my intro because I got so wrapped up in everything else.
Yeah,
it's The Queen of the Owls. Oh.
Yeah. So it's very funny because people will write to me and they'll say, when did you first get interested in owls? And there's no owls in the book. It's got nothing to do with owls. There's no royalty. I can tell the story of the title later, but the short answer to your question of what's it about is it's the story of a woman's search for wholeness, her true self, behind all the roles we play, behind all the repressions and missed things, but it's framed around the art and life of iconic American painter Georgia O'Keeffe. It's not a book about O'Keeffe. It's not a historical novel like you write. It's contemporary, but O'Keeffe is like the frame, the muse, the inspiration for my protagonist.
That's what I was going to say, is it's more like she's the muse, right? Mm-hmm. That's the word I was going to use as well. So right. Is O'Keeffe a muse for you? How did you get interested in her artwork and decide to have this protagonist want to be her and want to embody her and be so inspired by her?
You know, I've been asked this question a lot. There is no simple answer. I don't know. It happened. It found me. I mean, I had, there were few O'Keeffe paintings I knew about and was very drawn to, had a lot of meaning for me. But it just kind of happened. The actual story took 10 or 11 years for the seed to germinate. It's actually something I only realized when I was being interviewed by somebody else before the book even came out, which is that when my ex and I split, he took that damn flat screen TV off of the wall, which I hated. And I vowed to replace it with something that was really me. And I went out and I found this gorgeous poster of this big red poppy, which of course is one of O'Keeffe's most magnificent paintings. And I put it up there as my statement, my visual statement of who I wanted to be now. And it must have just stayed in my subconsciousness because it was 10 years later that this idea of Georgia O'Keeffe as this essence of a kind of fullness of womanhood found me. So it was quite magical.
Well, it's so interesting because your protagonist is on this journey toward wholeness. I always feel like that's O'Keeffe too, like leaving behind Stieglitz and finding her own voice and becoming her own woman. And then you have this story that you were doing that as well. How does your own journey interweave with your protagonist's journey? Were you writing this to figure out your own wholeness thing? What was that like for you?
it's a really wonderful question. This is fiction.
Yeah, I
It's
know.
not, no, but I mean, it's not a thinly disguised memoir. It's not catharsis.
Okay.
It's not, I had already processed certain things. And so I think when you are writing good fiction, you go deep into what you know emotionally about life, about what it means to be human, about relationships, about selfhood, etc. You go and you go and access all that, and you re-embody it in a fictional character, fictional situations. So much of the emotional truths in the book are things I know, I've come to know. The emotional journey probably is very related to my own, but I didn't do any of the specific things in the book. I certainly haven't posed nude, as we say, not yet. There's always tomorrow. That spoiler alert about the plot. But anyway, and the characters are not people in my life. They're completely fictitious. But of course, we draw on our own journey, but I think you can only write about it, not when you're still processing it, but later. So does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. But then I was going to ask, I was going to wait for this, but now I'm going to ask it now, and then I'll come back to the plot of this book. So we are living through this big historical moment right now. We are living through this huge pandemic that is this thing that we are all going to have to process, and we are all going to have to go through. Are you feeling like you're going to need, and you write contemporary fiction, so are you feeling like you're going to need time to process what you're living through, or is it automatically going to make it, like I know you have another book coming out in 2021, is it automatically going to sort of find its way into this next draft, like to the late edits, and it's going to weasel itself in there now, or is it going to take years to process this moment we're living through?
You know, it's a wonderful question, because the second book, well, I'll take a little detour first. This book, you could say, is the search for the wholeness of who I am, framed around art, photography, visual art, being seen. The second book is really the search for where do I belong, framed around music and the need to be heard. So the two books are very related. And I'm also what we call a serious amateur pianist. So that was more accessible to me in that way. Anyway, so that book has a sort of dual timeline. And I originally had actual dates in there. And then just before I handed in the final tweaked version, I said, I can't leave these dates in. So I just made it really generic. And I struggled with that, because not every book that's being written now or that will come out next year is going to be about this pandemic. And for many of us, it may take a long time to process, and maybe it never has to be in our stories. My story, the second book, which was already done, I mean, I've just been tweaking it, has its own form, its own situation and time. And to try to change it to reflect COVID, it is just not organic. But I've actually posted this question on writers' Facebook groups, because I wonder about it too. I mean, just the same way that every book written during World War II was not about World War II.
Right. I mean, of
Yeah.
course, and of course, it's not going to be.
Yeah.
Curious how you were sort of processing.
Yeah, I know. I've thought about it. I've definitely thought about it.
Okay, but then you said something in the middle of that. So you said you're an amateur pianist, and so your second book is a little bit more based around the idea of the art of music as opposed to the art of painting and photography. And you said you had easier access to the music. So go back to the visual arts.
Mm-hmm.
If you had a little bit of a harder, more challenging time accessing the visual arts, why? And what did it give you to get into the visual arts? How did that end up serving your writing in some way? I'm interested in art, so.
Well, it's not so much art as it is Elizabeth, that's the protagonist, deep need to be seen. She feels that her husband, for example, doesn't see her, and she is hidden. I mean, it's not just his fault. She doesn't really reveal herself. So that at that deeper level, that I could understand. And in fact, there's a kind of cool story about this that um, I was always the family photographer. So all these thousands of pictures of my kids, there's no mother because I'm the one behind the camera. And I never liked having my picture taken. And so when I was working on this book, it actually was in the early stages. I was doing a new website. I was revamping that old social worker website to become a writer website. And I needed a headshot. So I found this wonderful photographer, and we spent the whole afternoon. He took 100 pictures, and I had this experience of letting go and giving myself to the camera and letting him see me. I mean, you know, it was all from the neck up and it was clothed, but that inner, again, it's an example that the inner emotional experience of this letting go and being seen by someone, by the camera, and then looking at the prints. And so that is what I drew upon for my protagonist's yearning and experience of revealing herself.
Well, and it's such an old art historical idea that that women particularly are objects of sight. You know, there's the old ways of seeing, and there are all kinds of stories written about this, that we become the objects. So it's a fascinating turn that you're trying to become seen as opposed to being the object.
Well, when you are choosing to be seen rather than being defined by how someone else sees you. So there is this parallel whole thing in the book about feminist art, which speaks very much to what you're saying, because my protagonist is also teaching a course on feminist art. It's very complicated. O'Keeffe's relationship with that's like a whole nother hour we could talk about that. But and interestingly, I've written about this because I had a friend who worked, this is only tangential, but it's okay. She worked as a stripper to put herself through college. So we've talked about the empowering experience of choosing to reveal, of not being objectified, of owning being seen, as opposed to what you refer to, which just happens a lot in our culture, of no power, of someone else's gaze defining who we are. It's a very deep subject. It's one of the many things that I hope I have explored in this book. I mean, it's also about relationships and just so many things. But to me, a good book can be talked about, read, understood, felt on so many levels.
Prior to the pandemic, the Me Too movement was the biggest thing on the planet, right? I mean, it felt like one of the most monumental shifts in feminism in a long time. Now, I know your book was done by the time it came out, because otherwise it wouldn't have been finished. But what was your perspective on that moment, having delved so deep into these issues of femininity and wholeness searching and choosing to become choosing how you're seen? What was your take on that entire moment in our history?
Again, your questions are fabulous, because I had thought that this whole question of consent, which is very central to the book, would be the big thing that people would connect with. It's just like never come up. And I think if the book had been published a couple of months earlier, it would have. Interest fascinates me, but to me, one of the seeds of the book actually was, we get these what if moments. And I was very occupied with all the stories about that were coming out in connection with Me Too. I was very engrossed in that. So my little brain was going, well, what if somebody was very manipulative and he convinced a woman, a professor, because I was an academic, that to do something that she didn't really want to do, with this sort of academic seduction, if it will be great for your scholarship, it will get you noticed, it'll give you a new slant on your thesis, that it was a coin, or it was the way that she would be manipulated into revealing her body in a way that she would not have. So I started thinking about all of the implications and forms of consent or lack of consent. And in fact, one of the interesting questions in the book is Elizabeth's relation to consent, because I don't want to spoil it, but it's not so clear. And in a way, she's naive. In a way, she just goes, "What the hell?" And then she pays the price. Did Richard, the photographer, use her, manipulate her, or was he doing exactly what he said, and it was her own projection that she didn't want to think about what might happen? I didn't want there to be an easy answer. And I've enjoyed going to a few book clubs where people get really into this, like, was Richard, did he manipulate her, or was it just her own projection? So it's a very fascinating question. It doesn't exactly answer what you've asked, because there is no sexual abuse but there's sort of, well, anyway, it has so many ramifications, right? And we're not done. I mean, right now we have other things that are really at the forefront, but this issue of consent and the right not only to my body, but to images of my body. I mean, there are many stories, I don't want to get to politics of Katie Hill and all of that, of women whose images of their body that they thought were private became public.
I've been thinking a lot about how this interruption in our life, right?
Yeah.
If you want to think about it that way, in a way, it feels like an interruption, like a pause, and then we're going to go back.
We're not going
then
back.
We're
Go
not
back.
going back. It's going to be, it's like you're not going to be able to get back on track after this is over, because the track's going to be gone.
Life never works that way, right? And nothing is like that. You go on. And if I've learned anything during this time of launching a book during a pandemic, is that you got to let go of any expectations, requirements, and open yourself to whatever is offered, what's in front of you, and embrace it and give yourself to it, and don't cry about what you didn't get, and just adapt. Like, I had my dream event. I was going to have this great big event at George O'Keeffe's, right outside of her home at Ghost Ranch, New Mexico. They were going to, I mean, it was just incredible. They were going to invite the whole Santa Fe community. I mean, it was like my dream, right? Because Ghost Ranch is host to all kinds of retreats. They were having 5 OKeeffe, Find Your Inner OKeeffe. I mean, it was just like an amazing, it didn't happen. And okay. I mean, maybe in a year it'll still happen, because books don't go bad in a year. They're still, they're still relevant. But I think that's been a great source of kind of like, let's grow up, everybody. And I mean, I speak for myself, and just be with what's in front of me,
That is heartbreaking, though. I mean, you had to have felt the sadness and the grief over that, even though you are soldiering on, like we all are. Well, we all, I think, who had books come out right in the middle of this, had our moments of grief, and I think that's, and I've had so many friends who were in artistic fields, not only authors but musicians, and I've worked in Hollywood forever, so I had friends whose shows were canceled and movies were didn't come out. And as much as sometimes I feel like it's frivolous because there are more serious things, I also know that we are all going to mourn those moments.
Well, I tell you, this is the thing, we don't talk about this much, but it was a weird feeling. Like, I'm doing all these events and I'm like, oh, I'm so excited, I'm so thrilled, this is so great. And I'm, buy my book, which is what the base is. I mean, like, but I'm excited and this is wonderful. And I'm feeling, how can I say this stuff? Well, people are sick and dying and unemployed, and it's a very strange feeling. But the way that I've made my peace with it is that people still need stories, maybe more than ever. And reading books is one of the things we can still actually do. Mm-hmm. And people really need stories that speak to what it is to be human. And so I wish to give this and not apologize for it. But it's been a difficult, that's my social work, my clinician training. That
That's what I was going to ask about next. So this is your debut novel, but it is not your debut book, and it is not your first. You've had many careers, but the one that I did want to ask about is you have a PhD in clinical social work. Is that right?
Yes.
What? Tell me a little bit about that work and about your work in that, and how it has affected your noveling life. Like how it changed you as a developing writer during those years prior to becoming a brilliant novelist.
Well, when you're a clinician, you're interested in people, in what makes people tick, and how they deal with their pain, and how they yearn for connection and meaning, and how they deal with suffering, and how they navigate life and find out who they are. So it's the best preparation for being a novelist there could possibly be, I think. You have to genuinely be interested in the variety of human experience. And when you're a clinician, it's not you fixing people or giving them answers. You're the midwife to their own work that they do for themselves as they define it. So I think that when you write a novel, it's sort of like that too. You're maybe giving someone something that then works on them. They work with it in their own way, make their own meaning from it. So very, very related. But yeah, I've done a lot of things, and it's just kind of my nature to always try something new. It's just the way it is. I think it's all contribute. I mean, I ran a not-for-profit. I was an advocate for kids who didn't fit in. I was a full-time mom for a number of years, which was like a treat. All kinds of things, a researcher, all sorts of things.
But that goes in with that curiosity that you have to have in order to be a novelist. Like you have to have a curiosity about how different things work and how different parts of life are. I think that's common and a gorgeous thing amongst novelists to go out and try various things and then try to put them all into a book. What are the issues that book clubs are focusing on in this book that you see it may work on them over the next few years and it may inspire, I don't know, change or thought or issues people are grappling with that your writing's bringing up?
Well, I've only really just started, so I wouldn't want to generalize yet. But one of the things that surprised me is that people's interest in how Elizabeth navigates the roles in her life as a mother, as a sister, as a friend, and in a way as a wife. I mean, even though that has its own issues. So that's one observation I've had, that this, because it's close to people's own lives, right? How do we be so many different things to the people in our lives? And as women, it is what we do. We have a lot of roles, and to do them well, but also what else is there that's not a role?
But you said women in general, and this book is a lot about this, have a lot of roles that we fill, and that's particular to women more so than men. I'm hearing from you. I don't know.
Yeah, I know. Book clubs this is a book for women, right? Like it is. It just is. So I don't know how men, I can't speak for men. I'm not a man. So that was probably not an unwarranted statement, but certainly many of us women do grapple with how do we put this mosaic together.
Right. No, I'm just wondering whether or not as we march through what continues to be a feminist movement that started, hundreds of years ago in its own way, but then 100 years ago with the vote and then going through the feminist movement and Me Too and all that, if we are marching toward a place where we don't have to have this segregated life where I'm this person here and I'm this person here and I'm this person here, or if we're going to eventually arrive at a place where we are whole women.
who knows? I mean, the question of feminism, O'Keeffe, you know, she's like the matriarch, except she repudiated the feminists, as you may or may not know. I mean, she wanted nothing to do with them. She did not want to be thought of as a female artist, simply as an artist. And, you know, there's this story that when Gloria Steinem went to visit her with a bouquet of roses, O'Keeffe wouldn't let her in. You know, she didn't want anybody to make her their anything. And it was interesting because when she was first painting in the 1920s, the male art critics wanted to define her work genitally, you know, as just being very sexual and all that stuff. And then she repudiated their interpretation of her art, just as later she repudiated Judy Chicago and all those other, you know, the feminist interpretation. The men and women, she didn't care who you were. No one was going to tell her what her art was about. And she was famous for saying, just look at the paintings. And so, you know, was she beyond feminism? Was she already at this ungendered place that it's complicated, and we're not going to solve that, but these are definitely questions that my protagonist grapples with in the book. So
okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, so last question.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, we
for an hour.
I know. I could talk to you for a long time, but I don't want to keep you forever. So last question. Okay, so you were a clinician, you had a PhD, you wrote a nonfiction book. Now you've got this book, you've got another novel coming out. How are you feeling about noveling versus your nonfiction life that came before it?
Well, it's just different. I mean, each is great. You know, with the book you mentioned, When the Labels Don't Fit, which is a book about nurturing kids out of the box, quirky kids who don't fit in. And I would, for years, get emails from people saying, your book changed our family. It saved us. It changed my life. And I thought, oh my Lord, it can't get any better than this. But I'm getting emails like that about Queen of the Owls. So it's the same. You want to reach people. You want to mean something. You want to touch them. And whether you do it through fiction or nonfiction, I don't see that as being a dichotomy. I mean, when I was writing nonfiction, it was probably more from my mind. And I think writing fiction is more from a combination of mind and heart. So in a way, it's fuller. But that would be simplistic too. It just where life has led me now.
I love the way your brain works. You have just entertained me and inspired me beyond belief listening to the way your brain works. So I have loved it.
Great. That's so great. See, I've touched you.
Right? This is what this business is about.
It's what it's all about. It's totally what, if one person watches this and goes, oh my gosh, I just saw something new. I just understood something new. Then like, it was all worthwhile.
Story time with Stephanie Storey. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories.